Welcome to everyone to our series of international researchers or internationale Forscherinnen. Today we will have a presentation by Mateja Kos-Kolic. Mateja is Associate Professor at the University of Ljubljana, but also the chair of the Department of the Academic Unit for Marketing. So really something that's interesting not only to our students, but also to our faculty. I'd like to say where Mateja and myself know each other from. Mateja and I have been working in the European funded or commission funded research project Counter, which was on counterfeiting as well as on piracy, internet piracy. So that goes already in that direction. We are going to hear today from Mateja. Mateja is teaching consumer behavior, but also digital marketing. And that's the reason we are today talking about the dark sides of digital consumption. And Mateja, the floor is yours. Please share your slides and introduce us to the dark sides of digital consumption.
Thank you for your kind invitation, Eva. As already discussed and indicated by Eva, so we do know each other from quite a number of years ago. And the topic that I'm introducing today does build on the one that we explored in that European Commission-funded project. As already presented by Eva, I'm going to share with you some research that we did recently on the dark side of digital consumption. Why is this topic interesting? Because if you think about digitalization, it's an overwhelming trend. So the consumption of digital assets as entities accessed digitally without physical properties has been in our lives every day. So the digital landscape, however, also impacts how we behave. So it forms some new consumption patterns, which are interesting to explore because we want to know as much as possible about human beings and their behavior. So there are a couple of emerging dark side behaviors, some emerging, some existing for a couple of years now already. For example, one of them is digital piracy, which I'm sure every one of you already knows. Another would be also excessive use of social media or compulsive consumption of digital assets and so on. So these are some types of dark side behaviors, but our focus as such was more on two types, which is what the two are: hoarding and piracy. So we'll focus on those in a couple of seconds. Let me just first also stress the importance of why we should look at these dark side behaviors. So they are related, they tend to be related to stress, to how we experience well-being, and also pose different challenges to marketing and communications due to this digital clutter. But there are also some ethical concerns with business use of consumer data. So there are some nuances that we need to be aware of in the light of increasing digitalization and its impact on behavior as such. So the presentation that I prepared for today is based on a couple of sections. One of them will be the introduction, let's say a more fun part of the three core concepts, which are psychological ownership, digital hoarding, and digital piracy. Then we will look at the impact at this empirical study, which is composed of qualitative and I mean, not quality, but of an experiment and a survey. And in the final stage, we'll look at some implications as well as discussion of the results. So the three core concepts that I mentioned earlier are also present in everyday newspapers. So these topics are discussed not only academically speaking, but also when we open a newspaper, there are different pieces of news with respect to hoarding as well as piracy and this psychological ownership. Let's so first focus on psychological ownership. Maybe some of you are already familiar with the concept. It is described as some personal sense of possession over an object, which could be material or immaterial, but without legal claim. So we don't necessarily need to actually own an item or an asset or any particular entity, but can still experience ownership, the feeling of ownership. For example, a couple of interesting facts or findings based on research: touch seems to increase psychological ownership. So when you can touch something, people who physically interact with an object, either they hold it, touch it, or manipulate it, let's say, change it in any way, they develop stronger emotional connection and stronger sense of control, which makes them more likely to actually perceive it as their own. So this would be an indication of a stronger psychological ownership. Another interesting aspect of psychological ownership is that it affects sharing behavior. So people are less willing to share things that they have a stronger ownership over. So in case of stronger psychological ownership, people would not be that prone to sharing. For example, in playlists, this has been based on research also. Self-curated music feels personal but makes sharing less likely. Or people who choose and prepare meals, they guard them more. Or toys, in case of children, children who have toys for a longer time, they are not that open to sharing them. So in these cases, we see how psychological ownership is present and experienced in everyday life. Just one example, maybe you have a service also, I'm sure you do, in Vienna, so that you can rent a bike and take a ride. So when you rent a bike, in that case, you would also have this stronger sense of psychological ownership, even though the bike itself is not yours, but still you would perceive a certain level of this psychological ownership. Another concept which I'm going to tie to psychological ownership a bit later is digital hoarding. Probably much more discussed in different articles is physical hoarding, but digital hoarding refers to our inability to delete digital content from our computer or personal device, which then leads to overaccumulation of digital material. So, for example, this was one study done in case of the US population, and they found that people have on average 15 unread emails, 83 bookmarks, 2 unused or broken cell phones, 582 saved cell phone pictures. So this just indicates that we often keep content which we don't necessarily need. For example, also in case of photos, we might have a photo gallery which has this huge collection of images, but we constantly receive reminders that we need to make that space larger because it's already almost full. Or unused apps on your phone, or inbox. You might have a number of emails, maybe unread, or you just keep them because you think at one point they might come handy. So why do people hoard digitally? There are different reasons. Not all of them are listed here, but I would say a few that are most relevant in general would be that we might be afraid of losing information. So we might worry that specific files will get lost, or we might experience some sense of these files playing a role in the future. On the other hand, we might be emotionally attached to, like, if you think about photos, we can hardly delete photos, even though we might have 5 copies which are almost identical. Another would be fear of missing out, because we are afraid on missing out on important content or updates. Also, when we are more perfectionist, more anxious, in those cases, we would also tend to be hoarders, more likely. So a kind of set of symptoms which are associated with digital hoarding would be, as already probably tapped into in the previous slides, excessive files. So having a lot of different files, struggling to delete, having this emotional tie, being anxious over deletion, having disorganized storage. So these are some of the symptoms which might play a role in I would say, encouraging an individual to start treating those symptoms. Because digital hoarding also has some negative consequences, some of those being that a lot of the content that we have, if we have numerous items, they might slow our devices. We might be more stressed. This might also lead to lower productivity and also heightened cybersecurity risks. Interestingly, the physical hoarding is also correlated with digital hoarding. So a person who is a digital hoarder might be more likely also physical hoarder, so hoarding physical items. When is it time to clean? We might have used or broken devices, having a full inbox, desktop brimming with icons, having many text messages which go years back. Or we might have this tendency not to delete old photos, or we need to delete them so that we can make space for new ones, and similar, I would say, similar tendencies. One piece of research was showing that about 50% of Americans report symptoms of digital hoarding, which I perceive as quite a large proportion, and 20% of Americans have more than 100 items on their desktop. I was just explaining this to my daughter, and she said, "Yeah, that's our music teacher. He has all the different items on his computer because he has every item is intended as a certain melody that he then opens." So also I was trying to count my own. I don't think I reach 100, but close close to 50 probably. So also related to digital hoarding is the how many emails we open or just leave unopened, and 52% of emails that we receive we do read or open, but the rest we don't. So this just gives us an idea that in this world overflowing with information, we also tend to be more hoarders in the digital manner. I have up to this point talked about psychological ownership and digital hoarding. And the third topic that I'm introducing is digital piracy, which is, in our case, as we studied it, consumer practice of illegally downloading files such as music, movies, software from the internet. So digital piracy otherwise is more encompasses other aspects as well, but our focus will be more on the illegal downloading type. I would also like to share, with respect to digital piracy, some interesting data about share of global visits to different piracy websites, where we can see that almost half of the visits are intended to download TV series. About 27.5% is for different types of books and other publishing material, and then followed by film and music, and finally software. In terms of countries, geographically speaking, the top 5 countries in terms of the global piracy demand are the USA being the first, then followed by Russia, India, China, and France. So these were 2022 data. Things definitely might have changed up until this point, but we can observe these countries as having the highest number of visitors to such websites. In the case of music piracy, so when you pirate content related to music, we have a slightly different selection of countries. Namely, we have India, Iran, USA. And something that those who are more into TV shows might know, House of the Dragon was 2024 was topping with respect to being the most downloaded TV show, while in years before 2019, and then going back to, I remember, 2014 and 13 and so on, Game of Thrones was for a long time. So things do change. Generationally speaking, we also see some differences. So Gen Z, obviously the generation with the highest proportion of people who have ever pirated movies or TV shows, just followed by millennials, X, and baby boomers. When being asked whether people have accessed pirated TV shows or movies more or less or about the same amount this year, majority said that they access about the same, so about a bit more than half, while 35% access less and 11% more. Also, when asking people why they pirate TV shows or movies, they pointed out that they are interested in a specific show or movie, so they don't want to pay a full price for a subscription, or they perceive subscription prices too high, or they don't find the content available, or they want to avoid watching advertisements, or want to see the content before or as soon as it's released without having to wait. And 24% in case of US consumers would pirate film while it's still showing in cinemas. So this slightly also overlaps with the reason stated last in the previous slide. So we have now talked, or I have talked about psychological ownership and the 2 types of digital dark side behaviors, namely digital hoarding and digital piracy. Now let's focus on this empirical study that I'm going to present on the dark sides of digital asset consumption and consumer well-being, which was done in collaboration with my colleagues, Monica Cucartini from the University of Richmond and Irena Vida from the University of Ljubljana. So why is psychological ownership so important? Not just our, I would say, proposition, but also research shows that psychological ownership works also in case of intangible digital possessions, so not just physical items, and we tend to develop strong emotional and cognitive attachments to digital goods. So there are different pathways that explain why people feel ownership over digital content. One would be control. So if we have the ability to change or influence something, we start to feel like that's ours. For example, if we can customize the wallpaper on our phone, we tend to experience greater ownership over it. Also, self-investment. If we invest time, effort, or energy, we become more connected to the item that we're dedicating these entities to. And also intimate knowledge. The better we understand something, the more we feel like it's ours. So these are pathways or drivers of psychological ownership, which we didn't delve into, but we did delve into previous studies so that we got a sense of what exists in the literature already in the digital context. And what we found was that in the studies analyzed in our research, positive consumer behaviors as outcomes are often analyzed, like brand loyalty, purchase intentions, but very little research actually exists on the role of psychological ownership in case of negative behaviors like digital hoarding or digital piracy. So that's why we wanted to explore how ownership, this psychological ownership, impacts digital hoarding and digital piracy. Psychological ownership affects acquisition, which can be explained as piracy, as well as retention, which overlaps with hoarding. But then in the second part of our study, we also looked at some consequences of these negative behaviors. So we looked at anxiety and well-being. So that's the second part of the model, which we wanted to explore, because digital clutter tends to lead to greater stress, reduced productivity, and also some concerns, ethical and legal, arise from digital piracy. So that's why we wanted to see what the impact is on anxiety and well-being. On top of the concepts presented up until this point, we also explored cultural boundary conditions. So we were interested in how exactly do collectivist or individualistic orientation and uncertainty avoidance impact the relationships between variables discussed earlier. So collectivist values tend to lead to greater ethical concerns about piracy and digital ownership, while in case of individualistic values, we would see greater tendency toward more personal digital accumulation. And in case of uncertainty avoidance, we would see reluctance to engage in risky behaviors when high uncertainty avoidance is present. So people are more prone to avoid such practices, and vice versa in case of low uncertainty avoidance. So the cultural aspect is often overlooked in the digital piracy studies, so not very often examined. But our focus was more on the individual level of these orientations. So not exactly how do let's say how does a certain country behave with respect to collectivist or uncertainty avoidance, but more at the individual level, because obviously there are also differences with respect to individuals. So you might have, you might have Chinese who are in general believed to be more collectivistic, but also you see individuals within that society who are more individualistic. So we are interested in that individual level. And that's one of the reasons also why we focused on these two dimensions according to Hofstede's cultural value framework. So the two, as discussed, the two dark side behaviors, digital hoarding and digital piracy, were then linked to psychological ownership as an antecedent and anxiety and well-being as consequences. But there, apart from the anxiety part, there are also some other negative consequences of these dark side behaviors. For example, privacy, security risks, also legal and ethical issues. But often, when you look at especially piracy studies, you don't see many pieces of research that would go into consequences of digital piracy as such. So in light of this lack of such studies, we were also, for this reason, interested in finding out more. So digital piracy and digital behavior, digital hoarding are two negative types of behavior, but they also share some overlapping features. So both behaviors, they involve acquisition and retention. So they cover, let's say, a broader spectrum of what we can do with digital assets. They have common drivers like psychological ownership, and they may co-occur. So what we also observe in other types of dark side behaviors, so-called comorbidities. So when we observe two types of negative behaviors co-occurring. So for this reason, we proposed a couple of hypotheses. For the first one was that psychological ownership positively affects digital behavior, the hoarding behavior. The second, that psychological ownership positively affects digital piracy behavior, followed by two direct effects about the impact of these negative types of behavior on anxiety. So we assume and propose that both increase anxiety. Then we also suggest that anxiety negatively affects consumer well-being. Psychological ownership as such can increase consumer well-being, and digital piracy might positively affect consumer well-being. So two moderated effects hypotheses were the first one about collectivism. This hypothesis seems quite complex, but it basically suggests that the proposed effects of psychological ownership on the two types of behavior and psychological ownership on consumer well-being plus piracy on consumer well-being, these effects tend to be stronger, more positive for consumers who are higher on collectivism. In the second case, in the uncertainty avoidance, we suggest that the relationships between psychological ownership and hoarding and ownership and piracy will be stronger, more positive for consumers who have low uncertainty avoidance compared to those who have higher. This is the suggested model. The dark blue concepts are the key concepts, and the light blue indicate the boundary conditions related to the cultural dimensions. In study one, we first focused on the relationships, trying to establish the causal links between psychological ownership and hoarding and digital piracy, psychological ownership and digital piracy. And in the second study, using survey, we captured the whole model using a structured questionnaire. So let's now focus on study one, which is the experiment on this main effect. So trying to establish causal relationship between ownership and consumption behaviors, hoarding and piracy. For this purpose, we offered, the participants were actually offered a bonus for participating in our research. So we prepared a questionnaire on Qualtrics, and there recruited participants through Prolific. And basically we designed two types of scenarios, one for low psychological ownership and the other for high psychological ownership. In case of low psychological ownership, we would ask people to read the scenario where they imagine themselves visiting an online bookstore and download a sample of an ebook. But this sample is a random selection without specific formatting. They cannot edit it. It has a very generic file name. So nothing that would very much initiate or trigger the sense of ownership. On the other hand, the second part of the participants was asked to read the high psychological ownership scenario, where they read about personalized sample created exclusively for them, which they can customize and so on. So with the help of these two scenarios, we then, using a sample of 200 participants, we then also measured digital consumption behavior intentions, so hoarding and piracy, as well as the psychological ownership perception. We checked whether our manipulation worked. Also, experimental realism was checked with several items and a set of control variables. So as already discussed, mentioned, we collected data from 200 participants, and 23 of those were excluded because they could not correctly recall scenario details. On average, age was 34 years, a slightly higher percentage of females, and participants rated the scenario as realistic, which was the first check for us. Then we also checked whether manipulation worked. So for this purpose, psychological ownership was compared in case of low and high, and the difference was big enough to be significant. So the high ownership, psychological ownership condition had much higher, substantially higher mean compared to low. And then two analyses were done on testing the main effects of psychological ownership. In the Vancouver results, we divided the participants based on whether they were in low or high condition, and checked whether the differences in how they would go about hoarding and how they would go about digital piracy were substantial, and they proved to be substantial in both cases. And then additionally, we did a regression analysis where we used perceived ownership. So not the dividing participants based on whether they are low or high group, but based on how they actually estimated the psychological ownership dimension. And here also both digital hoarding and digital piracy worked well, with being the dependent variables having an impact on independent variable, which was in this case the perceived, the perceived ownership having an impact on digital hoarding and digital piracy. So all in all, with respect to study one, we can say that the psychological ownership manipulation was successful. We see an increase, we see that high psychological ownership tends also to increase digital piracy and digital hoarding, which leads us to conclude that based on the experiment alone, we can offer support for the first and the second hypothesis. So then in the second part of our study, we did a survey which encompassed all of the constructs presented before. So in this case, we wanted to investigate how psychological ownership actually influences digital hoarding and digital piracy, and then also assess their impact on anxiety and consumer well-being. So again, this is the model presented before. And for this purpose, we also used a US sample of 625 people. About a quarter of those were illegal downloaders, and the median age was 43 years, which is a bit older sample compared to the one that we used for the experiment. We used quite a set of established scales to measure all the relevant constructs. And what we found is that psychological ownership affects digital hoarding significantly. So it does lead to an increase in digital hoarding, as well as it leads to an increase in digital piracy behavior. Then we also found that hoarding leads to greater sense of anxiety, and digital piracy also increases anxiety. We could also demonstrate that anxiety reduces well-being, as already also supported by the existing literature. But psychological ownership, on the other hand, increases well-being. We could not support the hypothesis that digital piracy behavior would lead to an increase in well-being. We also examined indirect effects, even though we did not have specific hypothesis on this particular type of effects. But we could see that digital hoarding does have an impact on well-being through anxiety. Psychological ownership also seems to be impacting anxiety indirectly through digital hoarding and piracy, as well as the psychological ownership having an indirect impact on well-being. Then we also did a test on the moderating effects of collectivism and uncertainty avoidance. So we divided the sample into low and high collectivism groups. And we found that indeed, as suggested, psychological ownership relationship between this ownership and digital hoarding is stronger when we have high collectivism group, and similar pattern has been shown for the effect of ownership on piracy, but not in case of psychological ownership having an impact on well-being. So there were no significant differences in that case. When looking at the digital piracy and well-being link, we could see a reversed effect in low collectivism group, which also kind of explains the overall non-significance, because the plus and minus even out. And then we also had the uncertainty avoidance relationship or its moderating role examined in case of psychological ownership on digital hoarding. So a stronger effect when we have a low uncertainty avoidance group. And I would say slightly surprising, but in line with our hypothesis, effect of psychological ownership on digital piracy disappeared when we had high uncertainty avoidance group looking at the relationship between ownership and digital piracy. So as suggested, we could support majority of the hypothesis on moderating effects, as well as the direct effects, as already suggested. And now to conclude, so basically our study looked at the impact of digital technologies and how they interact with consumer behavior, because really accessibility does bring both benefits as well as challenges. And we were more focusing on the challenges part in this particular study. So the rise in digital dark side behaviors, not only piracy and hoarding, but also social media has been quite evident. When you have an addiction to social media, that definitely falls in the dark side digital consumer behavior. So our contribution can be described as examining psychological ownership as being the key driver of digital consumption, we investigated negative consequences. So in addition to the positive consequences explored in the literatures up to this point, we looked also at the cultural differences in people's attitudes toward digital assets. So by having those boundary conditions introduced, we offered these nuances and also explored the differences further. Overall, we can say that this strong sense of ownership, psychological ownership of things being mine, they tend to increase digital hoarding and digital piracy. So with the help of these findings, we can offer also support to the existing well-established psychological ownership theory. We found that digital hoarding leads to greater anxiety and lower well-being, while in case of digital piracy, when we have low collectivism, we would see a decrease in well-being, but in high collectivism, actually the increased digital piracy would be, increased well-being would be evident. With respect to the cultural moderators, so we found to tie into the comment just presented, collectivism strengthens psychological ownership's impact on hoarding and behavior and piracy behavior, uncertainty avoidance. In cases when we have low, we would have a stronger link between ownership and dark side behaviors. So we see that psychological ownership can drive both positive and negative consumer experiences, but we can also offer some public policy implications based on our findings. One would definitely be to manage digital hoarding and well-being, which could be done with the help of promoting consumer education on how to manage the digital files or digital assets, also raising awareness about the negative psychological effects of digital hoarding, encouraging more organized digital habits, which would then lead to reduced anxiety and increased well-being. Another set of implications can be drawn based on reducing digital piracy with the help of education. So if we focus more on these negative psychological effects for more individualistic consumers, but in collectivistic cultures, highlighting more societal risks or cybersecurity threats might work better. And finally, policy strategies that would help address psychological ownership. We could see that if we promote de-ownership models like renting, sharing in the light of sharing economy, that might be one track highlighting personal risks of piracy and hoarding related to uncertainty avoidance, and also encouraging responsibility over group-influenced digital consumption. Finally, our study, of course, also has us several limitations based on which we can also provide some future research directions. We used a very specific set of antecedents and consequences with respect to the digital piracy and digital hoarding behaviors. So exploring other drivers of digital hoarding, like anticipated regret, materialism, might be something worthwhile to explore in the future. Also, maybe broadening the context. In the case of the experiment, we used the ebook example, but since we know that downloading goes well beyond that, it might be worth considering other contexts like, I don't know, downloading music, for example. And offering multi-country comparisons will also be something worthwhile to explore. since we focused on the individual set of cultural dimensions, but going beyond that, introducing also cultures and the differences with respect to those, that would be something to explore in the future. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm open to any questions or comments.
Mattea, thank you very, very much for being here. I very much enjoyed listening to your talk, and hopefully you will visit us and have a look at our lovely lecture hall. So we would be really glad to have you coming over next time you're in Vienna. Just give me a call, and I would be really happy to invite you to our campus.
So thank you also everyone for your attention, and also Eva, many thanks for inviting me. It was lovely having a talk with you. So good luck, and hopefully everyone is on the right track, not on the digital hoarding side.
We'll try. Pia, be very strict with me.
So have a great evening, and thank you again, Eva.